I'm John Glynn. What I'm going to do today is have a look at the shutter priority mode, S, on your cameras probably. So if you have a look at the top of your camera, you'll find a letter S, or TV mode if you're using a Canon camera, time value. So time value and S for shutter. Shutter speed is related to this number, this type of number, which you may see through the viewfinder or on the back of your camera. It's about how quickly we can take pictures. So it's about time. So if I turn the dial here, you'll see that the time changes. And if you have a 1/ something, you're talking about tenths of seconds. So if I go this way, that's a 10th of a second. If I keep going quicker, that's a 60th of a second, 100th of a second, and so on. So it's 1/ something defines tenths of seconds, 100th of a second, 1/1000 would be 1,000th of a second. And if you go the other way and go for a longer period of time, which would give you seconds, we can then look at 1 second. 2 little dots above a number denotes seconds rather than inches, so it's seconds. 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 8, and so on. And most cameras can go down to 30 seconds, certainly single lens reflex cameras can, and other cameras like this particular model that I've got here, which is a Lumix, can go down to 60 seconds. Okay, so that's a whole minute of exposure time. So what we're doing here is relating time to taking a photograph. Why do we talk about time? What is the purpose of time in taking pictures? Well, we may want a specific time to enable us to capture motion, to freeze frame motion, or to allow motion. Okay, so when we take photographs in our head before we take a picture, we've already got an idea of the motion in the photograph. Are we going to stop motion, like you would do with sport and wildlife, or are you going to allow motion to flow, as you might do with water coming down a waterfall or something like that? So I've got examples of a couple of them anyway, of movement, so that you can get an idea of what I mean by motion. Okay, I've got a book here. I'll find a couple of pictures in it which define movement and long exposure times. As always, when you come to look for something, you end up never being able to find it, of course. So, oh, here we are. I've passed them already. So in these particular, I'll sit here, so there's the light on the page. You can see motion in these particular pictures. There's a bicycle moving, there's a motorbike moving, there's a car moving, but everything else is static. Okay, if everything was moving, that would be camera shake or motion blur, or well, it would be camera shake or something along those sort of lines, an earthquake or something. But because there's only the vehicles moving and they're moving quicker than the shutter speed, you get motion blur. The closer you are to something, the more blur you get in motion. So the bicycle is more blurred than the motor car, even though the bike was going slower than the actual motor car. So motion is about allowing blur to happen, and those particular pictures were taken at around about a 20th of a second. Okay, so 1/120 or 1/20 is 1/20th of a second. I could hand hold at that shutter speed with this particular camera that I was using, this camera here, and I therefore didn't get any blur from me moving, because obviously I'm moving as well, I'm shaking. And we all shake, but we all shake at different speeds, unfortunately, so there's no actual shutter speed we know precisely that's going to stop our own shakiness till we test it. But the shutter speed for movement is anything slower than the subject itself that's moving. So if you're wanting to freeze frame motion, it might be that you're taking pictures of, say, I've got a picture here of a bee, of all things, a bumblebee, and the bumblebee, I took the picture of that bumblebee quicker than its motion. and that was around about 500th of a second. So it was sitting on a flower. As long as I took the picture fairly quickly, then I wasn't in a problem of it suddenly buzzing away, because the shutter speed was quicker than its motion. So that's around about 500th of a second. But if it was somebody running, I may need to go much quicker than a 500th of a second. So when we're taking photographs, we're thinking of how quick we need to take a photograph, and that is determined by the shutter speed, exposure time, time value. Okay, in a Canon it would be TV time value mode. The idea here is we set the shutter speed for our particular subject or our particular way of seeing the picture. Okay, and the camera will do everything else. So if I set the shutter speed at a given shutter speed, the aperture will change automatically. And as long as there's enough light, I'm okay. If there's too much light, as there might be in this case, it will warn me. Here it's saying, look, if I take a picture now in this light at half a second or pretty much near there, I'm going to end up with so much light coming in that the picture would be overexposed. So I would have to go to a shutter speed which is quicker rather than slower. And that's still giving a shutter speed. Ah, there we are now then. The shutter speed is starting to change, or the aperture is changing. And the aperture will change depending on the amount of light it sees. So here it says I could take a picture of whatever it is the camera is pointing at a 60th of a second at f16. If I want to take the same picture but at a faster shutter speed, because I may still get camera shake at a 60th of a second or motion blur if my subject is moving fast, I would then go to a quicker exposure time, which would be a bigger number, and as you can see the aperture is automatically changing, the f number changes to enable the camera to see enough light. Now the actual aperture, the f number, it will be determined by your particular camera lens, the lens you're using, and therefore it may not get to certain numbers. Mine can go to quite small apertures, and therefore I can still take pictures in here and go quite high because my lens enables me to do so, because it's got an f number of 1.4. If your exposure time, if your aperture in your lens is say 3.5, then to do 3.5 I would be looking at something around this sort of shutter speed, okay, for the same amount of light coming in. So these are things which you look at, is looking at the aperture. If you go to a quick shutter speed and you don't have enough light, the camera will again warn you. So if I were taking a picture now, the reason it's flashing is because the picture is likely to be too dark. It will still take a photograph. The camera itself does not know what you're photographing, so therefore it will still take a picture, but it's warning you that this picture, given the shutter speed is very fast, and the aperture, although it's a wide aperture, still isn't allowing enough light in, then it's warning me that the picture is probably going to be too dark. Okay, while at the other end, when I had a long exposure, it was warning me that there'll be too much light. So the camera will give you a warning of some kind. Usually the aperture will flash. In this case, the aperture shutter speed is flashing and changing colour as well. So it's quite a dramatic visual warning that the camera is concerned about the light levels. If I have to take a picture at a fast shutter speed and it's flashing, then I would then look at the ISO number, and if the ISO is unable to change or go any higher, then I would have to rethink how much light I got, but I would be looking at the ISO as well, because the ISO will enable the camera to see, in inverted commas, more light. and allow more light in. So there's a combination of time, aperture and ISO, and it's those three things related together that will determine whether I have enough light coming into the camera. And the purpose of shutter speed is determining whether or not I want to allow blur in my picture or freeze frame motion when I take a photograph. So when we're taking pictures, we have to think about that before we take the picture, because if there's blur, we didn't want blur, it's too late effectively to do much about it. So we have to be looking at that relationship between shutter speed, aperture and the ISO number, okay, when we take photographs. So we're in shutter priority mode, we've already predetermined the sort of picture we're looking for. We're deciding usually that we want to freeze frame motion, and therefore we set the shutter speed at that shutter speed, and the camera will do everything else as long as there's enough light. Okay, so we can then determine exposure time, determine that before we take the picture. And the shutter speed itself will not change if we set it on shutter priority mode unless we change it. We can allow the ISO to change, because we could potentially put that into auto ISO and allow that to go up and down, and the aperture will change automatically to accommodate, hopefully, the amount of light we're photographing in and enable us to take photographs. In this case, because I've gone down to 800th of a second, I could take pictures in this room at f4 and the picture will come out because it's not going red and it's not flashing. So the camera's saying everything's perfect, okay, as far as it's concerned. So and as I say, as I move my camera around, depending on the amount of light it sees will depend on what aperture it goes to, or the aperture will change to accommodate. Now, the other factor with shutter speed is, as I've said earlier, is not only the subject matter that we have to contend with, it's our own shakiness as well, because if we are moving, then any movement we have will also impact the photograph and it will become a shaky picture. So if we have camera shake, and I've got an example of camera shake here as well, if I can find it, here we are, and that is a picture of flowers and they're all moving, okay, and I shook the camera during the exposure time for that. So if I'm shaking, then basically everything shakes. So we need to have an idea again as to how shaky we are before we take a picture, because we need a shutter speed quicker than our own shake to make sure that not everything is moving. The way I do that and find out how shaky I am is to go out with my lens on the camera, put it on shutter priority mode, and then photographing something which is not going to move, usually a sign. Street signs are very good because they're sharp. Car number plates are good as well because they're sharp, and I take pictures of them at different focal lengths with my lens. So if I was taking, if I had an 18 to 55mm focal length lens, I would set my lens to 55mm. I would then choose different shutter speeds, maybe starting at something like 100th of a second or 125th of a second, and then work my way down to a longer and longer exposure time, possibly down to 1/5 of a second. And then I would look at those pictures and see how shaky the signage is or the car number plate is, and if it's shaking and the building wasn't moving or the car is not moving, then it must be me. And then I would know that with that lens at that zoom, I can't handhold at a slower shutter speed than a 30th of a second or 20th of a second or whatever it might have been. I would do the same test, staying in the same position with something like the 35mm option on the lens and at 18mm on the lens. Now you can't change position, because if you move in closer to something, then that will impact again how shaky we are. So if you do real close-ups like macro photography handheld, you'll get more shakiness than if you walk away from something. So when you're setting the shutter speed, the closer we are to something physically, or the closer or the more we zoom in, then the more shake we apparently have, and a quicker and quicker shutter speed you'll need to overcome the shake. Now going back, before we had anti-shake built into the cameras and before we had anti-shake built into lenses. We used to go no slower than the focal length of the lens. So the focal length of the lens is the number on the lens. This one's got 25 on the lens. If you've got a zoom, there'll be two numbers, which would be like 18 to 55 or 70 to 200 or something like that. So they'll have two numbers, and that's a zoom lens. And traditionally, we wouldn't have gone slower than the focal length we're using. So if we were using a 55mm lens, then we wouldn't have gone to a slower shutter speed than, let's get this woken up again, camera's gone to sleep. As I take a picture, I'll get it all reawake. Here we are, and get the display up. So if I was taking pictures at with something like a 55mm lens, then traditionally I wouldn't have gone any slower than, say, something like a 60th of a second. Okay, so you would have said, oh, okay, I'm likely to get camera shake at anything below the focal length of the lens, so 60th of a second. If it may be that you shake more than that and you actually have to go faster. If you had a 200mm lens on, you wouldn't have gone slower than 2/50th of a second. So 250th of a second would have been the sort of shutter speed you would have looked at as a starting point. It doesn't mean you can't go slower, it just means that if you did go slower, you had a higher risk of getting camera shake. You could always go quicker, of course, because that wouldn't have been an issue as long as there was enough light. It was whether or not you could hand hold the camera without camera shake. Now that we have anti-shake built into the lenses or into the camera, and sometimes into both, you may be able to hand hold significantly longer periods of time. So it's a matter of testing yourself so that you would know that before you go off and take photographs. So when I know with my cameras, this particular camera, I can hand hold down to a 25th of a second with this particular lens, and I don't get camera shake. And I did a basic test where I photographed things which didn't move, and things that are sharp. Text is very good because you can read it, and if the text is shaky, then it must be me. Okay, so I did street signs. Car number plates, as I said, are also good at different shutter speeds. The smaller your focal length, in other words, the lower the number, 18mm, 10mm, the wider the angle is, the longer you can handhold before you see any discernible camera shake. It's just the way physics works. So do have a go, do test yourself on your camera shake. Do be aware that the purpose of the shutter speed is related to motion and whether we wish to freeze frame motion or allow motion in the picture before we take it. And the camera itself, if it can, will adjust the aperture automatically. If there is enough light, it will take photographs no problem and there won't be any warning. But if there's not enough light or too much light, then it should give you a visual warning that there's an issue, and then you can adjust either time again if you can, or you would adjust the ISO to enable you to take pictures under that given lighting condition. Okay, so have a go. Hopefully that helps to explain shutter speed somewhat, and I'll catch up with you again on another session. Thanks very much for watching.